So I'm sure, like me, on a regular basis, you ask yourselves these types of questions. What's the next step in my career progression? Have I got marketable skills? Or actually maybe what IBM likes to term employability. Is my job secure? Now the challenge that we've all got is that we're obviously living and working through very uncertain times at the moment, whether that's technological, whether that's societal, or obviously, reading the headlines today, economical. Now, it's very, very difficult, and our inner kind of crystal ball is very, very difficult to try and work out, actually, how do we navigate through this and anticipate some of the changes that are happening around us at the moment and try and predict how our careers develop along those lines. Now, we're all here today because we believe that cloud computing has got some part to play in the future of IT delivery. Now, what I'd like to try and do is spend a little bit of time investigating one potential outcome associated with that particular trend if it kind of follows its natural course. My name's Mark Tomlinson. I work in IBM's Cloud Solutions team, and my job is to primarily work with our largest financial services customers here in the UK, helping them develop cloud strategies and to also execute and actually implement cloud solutions within their organisation for business differentiation. So let's start by recapping on what are some of the pressures associated with IT or being put against IT organisations today. And you can't open the paper today without seeing at least one headline or another associated with the change that around us around technology, whether that's the massive growth of smartphone adoption and the shift in terms of the ways that consumers are interacting with your services over the internet, whether that's around the change in the way that people are expecting to collaborate with your organisation and interact with you on a day-to-day basis through the massive growth of social media, whether that's the challenge that many of our largest customers have got associated with making meaningful business decisions and meaningful business outcomes that related to the massive amount of data that's growing out there on a day-to-day basis. Whether that's about managing the massive expanse of infrastructure that's sitting within all of your data centers today and is continuing to increase despite our attempts to try and drive virtualization and standardization. And the ongoing security threats that sit in the background behind all of this, where there's a whole load of different external parties that are desperately trying to get hold of your data, and there's a constant battle to try and prevent that. By the way, the Identity Theft Resource website is very, very good, which is a statistic on there, but it's maybe the cause of sleepless nights if you go and have a look at it. So I think all of us are aware of what these pressures are. The challenge is, what are we going to do about them? Now, what I'll share with you is some information from some of our C-suite analysis papers, our CEO study and our CIO study. The CEO study was last published 2 years ago. The next generation of this is published next week, and I'll give you the details of that later on. And what this asks a survey of probably about 3,000 CEOs and about, I think, 1,500 CIOs is it gives you kind of paints a good news picture, which is actually there's a recognition within the senior IT leadership team and within the senior business leaders that actually there is at least a substantial amount of increase in complexity and a substantial amount of increase in change anticipated over the next 3 to 5 years. Now, what this slide doesn't tell you, but actually the report does, and that's one of the reasons why it's worth actually going and downloading it from our site, is it identifies a change gap. And what we mean by the change gap is people's anticipation of the amount of change that they're having to handle versus actually their internal ability to be able to manage change, and actually adapt to change. And the proportion is obviously substantially lower in terms of their ability to change versus their anticipation change. So something's got to give, is the point behind all of this. Now, let's face it, right? I think the track record associated with the successful delivery of IT projects within our industry is not particularly good at the moment, right? This is some data that from a survey that we did recently with, in conjunction with Forrester that was published in December of this year, where we looked at some of the key issues associated with IT project delivery and how do we go about overcoming them. And this is kind of the headline data associated with that. And what it highlights is the fact that, maybe what most of us are aware of in the room, this is not, I'd like to add, purely related to IBM projects, right? But this is the industry as a whole. Which is the fact that a substantial proportion of the projects are deployed over budget and behind schedule. Now, what it shows in here, actually, this data from Forrester is actually the trend from the UK specifically. And actually, the data in the UK is probably behind the overall global average. But the good news, at least we're not as bad as France, which is shows in red there. Right? Now, our CIO study basically focuses on the relationship between business and IT. And what it identifies is 4 typical mandates in terms of the way that IT organisations are being asked to empower the business. On the right-hand side is the traditional cost-focus area of IT, which is called our leverage mandate. And the leverage mandate basically says that the IT is a cost centre, and the focus is really around trying to minimise the cost associated with operating it and trying to drive out any kind of form of differentiation. That's probably one of the lowest levels of adoptions of mandates. You typically pick one of these 4. Expand, in the top left, is more about seeing the IT organisation expand in its remit to try and empower the business through things like business process improvement, business process automation, and driving internal collaboration. The transform mandate is typically where CIOs have been asked to try and use technology to automate and expand the value chain within an individual business. And the pioneer mandate, which is probably the smallest proportion in terms of our analysis of IT organisations, is about focusing on using technology to fundamentally shift the way that businesses are working to try and drive substantial new sources of value, revenue and differentiation. Now, within IBM, we've got a slightly different model, which we call COOPY. I'm sure many of you have seen this and heard of it before and maybe even applied it within your own organisation, which is commodity, utility, partner and enabler. So it effectively defines the characteristics of an individual business and the IT organisation and how it supports that particular business itself. Now, what's interesting is that the work that I'm doing in financial services organisations and their cloud adoption at the moment, and again, I'm sure many of you are in the same situation, is a maniacal focus on driving out a utility model, i.e. they're focusing on driving standardisation, driving automation, driving usage-based pricing in terms of their adoption. Now, if you think about the COOPY model, then actually where the value of the IT organisation increases around the partner and enabler areas rather than necessarily on utility. And you have to ask that actually, are we all actually heading in the right direction at the moment? So at least there's a recognition that the IT organisation needs to support the business and trying to tackle some of these particular pressures that we highlighted. And then the CIO study then effectively goes on and asks them, what are the key most important aspects associated with your visionary plan over the next 3 to 5 years? And at the top comes as no surprise, which is around analytics and the adoption of mobility and mobile technologies, which I'm sure is on the top of many of your lists as well. However, what's reassuring to see in here is that actually cloud computing and virtualization, which we all know is kind of the initial first starting point associated with private cloud adoption, are increasing in terms of their level of focus and how important they are in terms of the plans for these CIOs that were interviewed. Now, again, I'm not sure if it's easy to see this at the back, but the 3 bars that are against each one of those shows historical data from our previous CIO survey and the latest data from the 2011 survey compared to the global average, and the first 2 data points are in the UK. So what it shows is, and I think that highlights Emma and reinforces Emma's point at the start of the presentation, which is that cloud computing, more than any other area, is on the increase in terms of its adoption. What it shows is the fact that the UK, and I think this is evidenced from both the conversations that we have within our customer base and also when we compare notes with our colleagues around the world, that actually the UK is a hotbed for cloud computing adoption at the moment. And I think that we're kind of really pioneers in many areas, whether that's around coming up with innovative delivery models, whether it's coming up with innovative commercial models associated with that. We see ourselves as kind of really being at the pioneering and front in terms of cloud computing adoption. But it's important to recognise, and again highlighting the point that Emma made at the start of the presentation, is that actually this is not just about IT. Yep. Although it is about responding to the business challenges associated with some of these technological trends. And this is another survey, and this is kind of my final data point before we go on to the rest of the presentation, which is again off a relatively recent, start of this year, joint study that we did with the Economist business unit, which is called The Power of Cloud Driving Business Model Innovation. And the survey specifically focuses on the business and transformational aspects of cloud computing adoption versus the IT ones that we all know and love around driving agility, time to market, and reducing cost. And what it shows, and I think this reinforces again, the experiences that most are having on a day-to-day basis, is that people are primarily focused on the technological impact of cloud computing today. But over time, the expected impact from a business perspective, whether that's about the external challenges associated with change, whether it's around the shift in their value propositions to their customers, whether it's around the change in the way that they operate their value chain, or whether it's a shift in the way that they actually manage their customer relationships, is expected to substantially increase over the next 3 to 5 years as well. So it's not to be overlooked. But my focus today is primarily on the IT organisation. Now, at the IBM stand, you'll find a copy of this white paper, which the UK IBM team published at the start of this year, which is called The Future of the IT Department. And what this does is takes the conversation and the challenges that we've just had to one potential outcome, which is to say, what's the impact of cloud computing adoption on the IT organisation? And it also addresses 2 specific questions that we get asked on a regular basis. So the first one is, will cloud actually completely replace the IT department? And the second one of which is, as we move towards cloud-based adoption, what are the roles and responsibilities that are going to be increasingly important in my IT organisation moving forward? Now, the paper itself investigates one very particular and extreme scenario. And it's for an organisation or an enterprise that's chosen to consume all of its IT services from external providers, whether that's software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Now, what we all know is the reality of where we're all going to be is very far from that. Yeah, most of us are going to be living in a hybrid world where we're going to be having to manage a combination of on-premise infrastructure and being able to somehow provide a consistent governance and service management process that sits around these external service providers as well. But for illustration of the point, and just to allow us to investigate the potential, the art of the possible, then we take this particular extreme view. Now, don't worry if you're sitting at the back, I'm not going to go through all of this on this particular slide, but I thought just to highlight, to start off with, what was the model that we used for actually the analysis, which is the heart of the white paper. And this is called IBM's component business model. Now, many of you have seen this technique or similar techniques before. Many of the major consulting firms use these along with our own. And the component business model is effectively a functional breakdown of an organisation into its key capabilities and components. And we typically use it for business transformation. So we have component business models for various different industries. So we've got component business models for insurance, financial markets, banking, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's utilities, and whether it's public sector as well. We have standardized models, and then we work with customers to help them benchmark themselves and understand where their capabilities lie, and where we're building heat maps associated with potential focus areas for differentiation. Now, this particular variant of a component business model is specifically focused on the IT organisation. So it's as if I was to run my IT organisation as a business on itself, then actually what are the capabilities and components that I need to particularly run an IT organisation. Now, the model itself is broken down into a series of vertical competencies. The first grouping on the left-hand side is around planning and management. The second grouping is around building and deployment, or transition, as we like to call in ITIL type terms. And the right-hand side is primarily around the operational service run type functionality. And from a horizontal perspective, then each one of these then components and capabilities is broken into, the top group is around strategic direction. The second group is around control and effectively enforcing that direction and that strategy and governing it. And then the bottom group down the bottom is focused around the actual day-to-day execution associated with those particular pieces of infrastructure. Now this, which is the kind of the heart of the paper itself, is the model that's after cloud. And what you can see is, bear in mind that the model was originally yellow. So the areas that are in yellow remain unchanged. Yeah? The areas that are in dark grey are the ones where, in this extreme scenario, those areas are no longer needed. And in the light grey areas, where a substantial amount of that scope of that particular capability within the IT organisation has been reduced. Now, the areas that are highlighted in red, regardless of whether their scope remains the same or has been reduced, are the ones that become increasingly more important. Yep. So what you can see is that actually the model, it's the devil's in the detail associated with this. So let's look at this from a high-level viewpoint to start off with before we drill into some of these particular areas. So the good news, I think, for many of us, is the fact that actually a large proportion of the job roles within the current IT organisation remain, although their scope and the demands in terms of resourcing to support them is substantially reduced. Again, for many of you who are in senior leadership roles, architects, strategists, service delivery leads, it's the strategic roles are the ones that are impacted less than maybe the day-to-day operational and development ones. Yeah. And build and run are the main casualties. Yeah. So the building and delivery and service delivery of the applications are obviously, as you would expect, where the large portion of that responsibility goes to the cloud provider. And the final one, which is the red areas, are primarily around planning, around the commercial models, and managing the relationship between business and IT are the ones that increase in importance. So now, what I'd like to try and do is, there's 8 kind of high-level competences within the model, and I'll just pick 3 for the purposes of illustration to go through. I'm choosing, I think, strategy, administration, and service delivery, because I think those are particularly interesting. I could have picked security, which the paper talks about as well, and I know that's a hot topic for many of you. And again, there's quite a strong point of view in terms of resiliency and security in terms of moving forward in this cloud model. But let's look at strategy in the first instance. So from a strategy perspective, I think the first thing that it highlights is this component, and again, hopefully the text is slightly bigger on this version of the slide, which is one of our vertical slices, is that the actual overall technology and governance strategy, i.e. defining the relationship between business and IT, typically remains unchanged. Managing a portfolio of projects and their demands on IT is reduced in scope but increased in importance, because one of the things that you need to do is then focus increasingly on standardization. So identifying standardized services and being able to try and drive out and remove this kind of behavior associated with building out bespoke solutions. Yep, so taking advantage of that and effectively defining common service levels and a service management strategy associated with that that's consistent across all of these different service providers. Enterprise architecture remains, but becomes significantly simplified, because obviously the large portion of the responsibility is delegated to the external provider. The financial management remains, but actually that could potentially be done elsewhere, actually within the line of business, the kind of the control system associated with financial management. The underlying innovation of the technology platform is typically something that would be delegated directly to the cloud provider, although obviously you need to provide some form of innovation in terms of deciding as to which providers you select. Don't know if there are any project managers in the room, but the good news is that project management survives the move to cloud. Again, increasingly, as these services become adopted, then there's still the need for being able to do effective program and project management associated with their adoption. And the final one on the list here is around knowledge management. And again, some of the knowledge management aspects would need to be retained by the cloud service provider, and in fact you could delegate that as a function directly to a provider itself. But again, it remains in here because some best practices need to be retained into the IT organisation to refine and drive innovation. So if we focus on the second one, so I said I wanted to show 3. First one's strategy, the next one's administration. So from an IT business administration perspective, the overall operating model associated with the IT and the definition of it and defining the strategy reduces in scope because the IT organisation itself reduces in scope. The financial management obviously remains, as you would expect, because they still need to manage, maybe less so capital expenditure these days, but in this particular model, but certainly maintain the operational expenditure. Site and facility administration in the model selected is no longer required. I think you could argue that might not necessarily be the case, because obviously you've still got desktop services that you need to manage. You've still got networking infrastructure that you need to manage as well. But certainly traditional data center services are no longer required in this particular model. From a HR perspective, because the size of the organisation is decreased, then obviously the amount of resources required for HR is decreased. But what's interesting is there's these 4 areas at the bottom here, which are primarily around managing the relationships and identifying strategic suppliers. Both remains and is increasingly important. Whether it's around actually then the overall procurement process, and whether it's around managing and coordinating the life cycle of those services with particular suppliers that you select, is increased in importance as well. And the final one, which is around contractual negotiation and pricing. So one of the things that we see is that there's a requirement for an aggregation point here, maybe still retained within the organisation, so that actually if you're consuming services, maybe even for composite services from multiple providers, then there needs to be some sort of form where actually you'd be able to aggregate that into a single bill to the line of business. So my final focus is on service delivery. Now, if you're not actually running any IT services, the question is, do you actually need any service delivery functionality or not, or capability or not? And the answer is probably yes, but certainly from a strategic perspective, once you've made the decision that actually you're primarily going to use, or entirely in this case, going to use external services, then actually defining the strategy becomes largely redundant. Yep. The overall support strategy and service delivery control is effectively delegated to the service provider. And resource planning, which is typically a substantial proportion of the IT organisation around capacity planning, reduces in scope in our illustrative model. But what you need to focus on is demand management. So having increasing and improved relationship with the business and anticipating the types of systems and types of functionality and the volume of users and customers that are going to use these systems will increase. But obviously the underlying capacity is provided through the multi-tenant model associated with the cloud provider. The overall service delivery, operations, and actually day-to-day administration of the infrastructure is obviously the mode of the cloud provider now. But what's interesting is the actual support itself, the support infrastructure and help desk, does remain. So there's an expectation that typically level 1 support would still be in this particular model. Level 1 would remain in the organisation, whereas obviously level 2 support would be provided by the cloud provider. Now again, you could argue, and I'm sure many of you are outsourcing your help desks anyway, so actually maybe level 1 could be outsourced too. So the paper then goes on and includes a few other different observations as well. So the first one of which is, what's the major inhibitor for anybody to actually successfully adopt this particular model? And it's to overcome the challenge associated with the fact that the only thing you can do is pick from the services and offerings that are available that are out there today, versus going in there and avoiding the temptation to build out bespoke services. Yep. And that may have an impact not only on the IT organisation, but potentially on the business model as well. Yep. So business may be, as a result of this decision, actually constrained in what it can do. Governance remains increasingly important as well. Now, at the last Cloud Circle event, we were involved in one of the roundtable discussions, and somebody pointed out something that I thought was very interesting, which was the fact that many organisations have spent a lot of time locking down the desktop, whether that's removing and disabling USB sockets, whether it's taking out CD drives and so on, to avoid not only security issues, but also to try and stop people actually installing software that, just for personal use, rather than necessarily going with the strategic corporate standards. Now, if what you're doing is actually primarily consuming software through SaaS-based delivery models, where effectively a business user can just go in via a browser and their credit card and actually go and consume services, then it provides a different challenge for governance, because you don't have the same level of controls. So there's definitely an opportunity for some aspects or shift in the technology to try and allow people to govern that more effectively at the moment, and I don't think anybody's really nailed that yet. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, this is all very good, but surely there's still a role for integration. Yeah? If you're providing and consuming lots of different bespoke services from a variety of different providers, somebody's got to glue all this stuff together. Now, what's interesting is that whilst that's one potential activity that you could do internally as a resource, it's also important to see that there's an opportunity to maybe source that as a service as well. IBM and I know a number of other suppliers have already got integration platforms that already sit there out on the cloud with standardized templates that define key integration patterns in terms of data transfer and maintaining data quality between multiple SaaS-based service providers today, whether they're applications or underlying infrastructure. So potentially there's a scenario where actually even all of the integration or a large proportion of the integration work could actually be sourced as a service externally, and actually a large proportion of the effort goes away. And the final piece down here is around relationships and service providers becomes increasingly important, and that's a point that I iterated on the previous slide. But what we're also seeing is an emergence of a model where actually there's a lead provider, yeah, and a number of systems integrators, IBM being one of them, and a number of the other of our other partners that are out there as well, are looking to move themselves to market to be the integration hub. So i.e. we will manage the relationship between all these different service providers on your behalf. We will consolidate all of the contracts for you, and they will provide a consistent service level and management associated with it. So potentially, actually, even that might necessarily form a core part of your organisation moving forward. So there are a couple of other things I wanted to highlight. Sort of 5 minutes or so left. The first one of which is around skills. Now, many of you, like me, have probably come through in terms of your career development through junior roles. So that's typically, in my case, in application development. Maybe some of you have been involved, have come through service delivery, but to move into these kind of senior strategic roles in the IT organisation. And the challenge is that actually, if this model really is adopted, where do those resources come from? Now, you could argue that actually they're going to come from the service providers. So there's still a requirement for doing development, still a requirement for doing a service delivery in them. And then effectively, when they want to look for their next step in their career development, you could actually pull them into your organisation and perform some of these senior roles. But the challenge is that actually, maybe those roles don't reside in the UK. Yep. And also, because of the fact that typically SaaS-based service providers massively drive the level of automation compared to maybe a lot of the existing on-premise compute and infrastructure that's done today, then actually maybe they're going to be fewer in number as well. So I think there's a real challenge associated with trying to bridge this gap and empower people to have the right level of skills moving forward in this new world. Academia's got a part to play. I think a lot of the learning service providers have also got a part to play to make sure that there are standards, and I think that we're not all really quite there yet, to make sure that people are equipped with the most effective skills and to work in this model. And I think that as individuals and leaders within your IT organisations, I think you need to think very carefully about your resourcing and retention plan as a consequence of that. Now I wanted to touch a little bit on private cloud. The focus has been primarily on public cloud adoption and SaaS-based adoption. What we're seeing is an increased interest for customers looking at private cloud, particularly popular in financial services and no other sections as well, in looking at converged devices. This is our new Pure application system, or part of our Pure Systems announcement that was made probably less than a month ago, which is around an integrated system that's got compute, storage, networking, operating system, hypervisor, and also the middleware stack, all provided through a single and integrated management system. Yeah, so a single pane of glass to effectively manage all of the aspects that would typically be operated by potentially dozens of people across a variety of different IT silos. Now, we're involved in a lot of conversations with customers about the adoption of this, and ours isn't the only one that's out there in the market. But what's important to point out is the fact that the conversations we have with customers are typically about them trying to force fit the way that these systems work into their existing organisational design and say, actually, can we lock down just the networking configuration so that our networking team can only access and change that configuration? Can our storage team are the only people who are allowed to change the storage setup associated with it? And the challenge is that if you want to get the maximum value out of that, you have to think very carefully about what your organisational design is and actually say, is there an opportunity to build a multidisciplinary team that effectively tries to break down the silos associated with this type of, maybe even if it's just ring-fenced around the level of adoption associated with these appliances to start off with, so that you can maximise and capitalise on the benefits that these bring. So I think the private cloud is not just about technology, but it's got to be about a shift in the way that you run your processes and the shift in your organisational design to support them as well, to really capitalise on the benefits that they bring. So I thought I'd finish by introducing you to my two personal next generation digital natives. I'm pleased to say that they're not playing Angry Birds on my iPad. That's a Leap Pad, which is, I think, probably one of the hottest toys that was out there at Christmas this year. It's a nice way of allowing them to kind of do educational games. They do digital content creation, so they do drawing pictures, they take digital photos and videos and stuff, and my kids love it. And my daughter, by the way, who's only 2, really has only ever interacted with touchscreen interfaces as well, but already has probably produced more digital content than I did in the first 15 years of my life. So if we go back to the opening point and say, this challenge that we focused on at the start around the growth of pervasive devices, the number of devices that are connected to the internet, the growth in smartphone, whether it's around the amount of data that we're having to consume as individuals and as an organisations, whether it's around the shift in the way that people are interacting with you and your organisation, this isn't just a short-term issue. This is going to get worse, right? And when they're your customers, or your constituents, then actually you've got to really think about how are you going to be able to handle some of these types of challenges. And the way that we're doing it at the moment is going to break. I don't think we're going to be able, as organisations, to be able to manage the level of change that we're going to see as they move forward and certainly become your next level of customers as well. So if that's the case, then actually maybe the scenario that I painted in with the paper that paints isn't actually that unrealistic. And maybe we do have to do something that's fundamentally different than we've done before in terms of IT delivery. And if that's the case, then where does that leave all of us? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I've finished with a plug, which is, I mentioned at the start, our new CEO study. The 2012 Global CEO Study is coming out next Tuesday. There'll be, I think, a large amount of publicity associated with it. But what's interesting, I'll give you a sneak preview as to what the headline is is the fact that it recognises that for the first time ever, senior business leaders recognise that technological change is the biggest impact on their business moving forward as well. It's going to make a fascinating read, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading it. Okay, so let's say thank you very much for your time.